Are you familiar with Loki's wager?
Explain it to me.
So I think Loki makes a wager with two dwarves or whatever, and eventually they say that they can cut his head off. It comes to the point to where he loses the wager. They go to collect their bet, and when they're trying to figure out how to cut his head off, they're arguing over what part of the neck is when the head starts, and then the rest of the neck begins, basically. And the argument he eventually makes is, well, you can't take even a centimeter, an inch of my neck, therefore you're not allowed to cut my head off. You're trying to argue right now that because I might not consider 2 people in insurrection, that I can't possibly consider 2,000 people in insurrection. That's the same as you saying, since I can't tell precisely where your head ends and your neck begins, I might say that your toe is part of your head. This argument is nonsense. And the only...
Okay, so first of all, the reason, as I said at the start, why historical comparisons or historic comparisons to other incidents are so important is because there's a gigantic ideological and partisan motive here in exaggerating the extent to which what happened on January 6th was a serious threat. And especially when somebody is a Democratic Party partisan who goes around saying the Democratic Party is better, we want people to go and vote for Democrats, we want to make sure Donald Trump doesn't return to power, and at the same time, the narrative they're pushing coincidentally aligns perfectly with their partisan agenda, then I think it's important to start questioning whether or not there's any authenticity to the beliefs based on how other situations have previously been treated. So let me just make 2 points here about what Donald Trump did. You're actually allowed to summon people to Washington to protest. It's one of the most important rights that the Constitution guarantees.
So in this one, Woke Destiny debates Glenn Greenwald and gets completely obliterated, like to the point where I can't believe he actually posted this to his channel. Maybe it was live, I'm not sure, but every single point that he makes, Glenn Greenwald completely shuts down. And one of the funniest things about it is Destiny makes these points and then he's like, mic drop. And he has no mic to drop. He had no point that he won, and it's just all going on in his head. It's so funny to me, and I giggle, right? So anyways, I know you're going to enjoy this one, so let's get her started.
Or rebellion. That's just historically, you keep saying historically, that's never been the case. It's never been the case that we've had to establish that it would have never been the case, for instance, if only one state seceded and they had no realistic chance of winning in the Civil War, that we would say, oh, well, they weren't insurrectionists or rebellionists because they were never going to win. So on that ground of like they have to have a realistic shot at winning, I just don't think that's just not grounds ever for an insurrection or to declare something insurrection or rebellion. It's just a way to minimize the events that actually happened because they happened to not be successful. When we talk about how
if it's a joke, then if it's a joke, it should be treated as such.
But if it was a joke,
world historic event.
It was a historic event.
That threatened the United States government.
It did threaten the U.S. government. It was a historic event. What other time in U.S. history has the certification of the vote been delayed?
The certification, we've had so many official proceedings of Congress, including things like confirming Supreme Court justices, delayed because people went to Capitol Hill, entered Capitol Hill, occupied Capitol Hill, and protested the proceedings and ended up delaying the proceedings. There have been proceedings to vote on wars where anti-war protesters have disrupted. So all the time we've had people entering the Capitol, protesting congressional proceedings, and never are the ones who don't use violence accused of felonies, let alone anything resembling the kinds of charges that the January 6th defendants faced, because the ideological component here is what made this to be something so much bigger than in fact what it was.
I'm going to ask the same question again. When in the history of the United States has the certification of the electoral vote, the peaceful transfer of power from one president to the next, been delayed by protesters or violent protesters?
And that's where I'd like to ask Destiny, what does anything that happens on the date January 6th have anything to do with the peaceful transfer of power that actually happens on January 20th, which Trump left when he was supposed to? There was no delay of peaceful transfer of power at all.
I'm happy to concede that this is the first time that people went on January 6th.
Then it's historical. Then it's historical.
And interrupted the proceeding.
Yeah, then it's historical, right? By definition, it's a moment in history that is unique.
It wasn't a serious disruption.
They delayed the vote, didn't they?
By 3 hours or by 4 hours.
For the first time in U.S. history, yes. That's significant. That's serious.
Why is it more significant to delay this proceeding than other congressional proceedings? Things like voting on wars or confirming Supreme Court justices are pretty serious, too, in terms of the things Congress is supposed to do under Article 1. But the reason we don't consider those protests, even though they might have delayed the proceeding some, to be historic or serious or an insurrection, is because they never posed a threat to the stability of the United States government. In order to have an actual insurrection of the kind that you want to claim this is, you would need enormous numbers of very well-trained people who are heavily armed with serious plans to go into the Capitol and overthrow the power of the United States government.
If you enjoy content like this, make sure to like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell.
This is the kind of drama queen behavior that has dominated the Trump years, where every kind of event is catastrophized to its highest extent.
So you would say that any past, so like the Whiskey Rebellion in the United States, that's stupid. They shouldn't have called it that. They should have called it like the farmer protest or something different, or because what you're saying right now, it stands in contrast to how every other person viewed insurrectionism or insurrectionists at the time when, say, the 14th Amendment was drafted and ratified. People viewed people sometimes as being insurrectionary or giving aid or comfort to enemies of the United States just for letting their children go off to war to serve the Confederacy. It's nice if you, Glenn Greenwald, personally have some view of what you personally think an insurrectionist or rebellion might look like or what it should be, but to be quite frank, your opinion doesn't really matter. The opinion would be the historical relevance of the saying in the United States. It would be the historical analysis that exists for historical rebellions or insurrections in the United States, which oftentimes had very little to no chance of succeeding. Even the insurrectionists themselves thought that they were going to succeed. And we would use that analysis that exists at the time when, say, the 14th Amendment was ratified, and then we would use that going forward to figure out what do we think an insurrection and a rebellion is.
Well, I know one thing. It's definitely not an insurrection when Capitol Police open the doors, the guards to the building open the doors and let people walk around who stay within the velvet ropes, old ladies that wave their little American flags. I mean, even the shaman guy was escorted around by the Capitol Police. They didn't try to stop him once. He went into the chamber, he said a little prayer, and then they left. Yes, there was some bad people that fought with police that day, and those people have been held accountable. But I wouldn't even call those people insurrectionists. Everybody left their weapons at home. It's not by any means a definition, doesn't fit by any means the definition of an insurrection. That is complete nonsense to think that people that day actually thought they were going to take over the United States government by walking into the Capitol building and waving flags. I mean, come on.
And again, you can try to minimize and you can try to call it ideological and whatever you want. None of those congressional protests that you mentioned in the past rose to a level where tens of thousands of protesters were violently breaking into Congress and delaying the certification of the presidential vote.
You just got done saying that the maximum number of people who entered the Capitol was 2,000. And now you're calling it tens of thousands of people because you know so well. In fact, you conceded in the very first question I asked you that of course there has to be a quantitative component in terms of the gravity of the threat in order to seriously call it an insurrection or a coup, which is why I began by asking you whether or not if two people armed with knives went to the Congress and demanded that Donald Trump be removed after he was declared the winner and threatened to use violence with their knives, whether that would in the history books or by our major newspapers be referred to as the United States fighting off a coup or an insurrection. And you said, yeah, I mean, I guess if it's just two people, then it would probably be pretty ridiculous to call it that. So I see this, what happened on January 6th, a 3-hour riot that even the FBI's informants on the ground told the FBI in real time was never intended to be any kind of premeditated violent act on the part of most people, but instead was something that happened spontaneously, as so often happens where political protests confront the police and become violent. I see it much more akin to the kind of ridiculous example that I began by asking you, where you conceded that wouldn't be called an insurrection, than I do some kind of Civil War type situation or even a meaningful armed rebellion of the kind that happened in Russia last year, where even that was crushed in 12 hours.
Are you familiar with Loki's wager?
Explain it to me.
So I think Loki makes a wager with two dwarves or whatever, and eventually they say that they can cut his head off. It comes to the point to where he loses the wager. They go to collect their bet, and when they're trying to figure out how to cut his head off, they're arguing over what part of the neck is when the head starts, and then the rest of the neck begins, basically. And the argument he eventually makes is, well, you can't take even a centimeter, an inch of my neck, therefore you're not allowed to cut my head off. You're trying to argue right now that because I might not consider 2 people an insurrection, that I can't possibly consider 2,000 people an insurrection. That's the same as you saying, since I can't tell precisely where your head ends and your neck begins, I might say that your toe is part of your head. This argument is nonsense, and the only way that you can make the argument is to continue to try to make comparisons to other more extreme coups or more intense insurrectionist attempts, which I agree. There can be more extreme insurrectionist attempts. There can be more extreme coups. But the reality is, even if you want to wind it all the way back down, even if you want it all the way back down, say, like, okay, we'll ignore the tens of thousands of protesters outside. We can just go with 2,000 people. Glenn, how are you seriously going to argue that 2,000 people inside the Capitol with the goal of delaying the certification of the vote, which they accomplished, doesn't represent an insurrection?
Wait a second, Glenn, just before you go on, I just want to put you on Glenn's question. So Glenn's question was, he said an insurrection when there's an actual threat to democracy. I'm pushing off that a vote isn't a threat to democracy. At what point did you call it an insurrection? Would you call it an insurrection on January 6th?
I don't know, here's the thing. I don't know the thin line that they'd have to cross to call it an insurrection, but whatever line that is, it was crossed a long time ago. You had the President of the United States calling up over 100,000 people to D.C., and then he riled them up, saying that they needed to essentially delay the vote. He was relying on Pence to do it. All of those protesters went to the White House. A lot of them, or not to the White House, sorry, to the Capitol building. A lot of them broke into the Capitol building with the goal of delaying the certification of the vote because they didn't like the outcome of the election and they wanted to change it. They needed to fight like hell to take their country back because Mike Pence wasn't going to do the right thing by helping Trump do his constitutional coup. And so they turned it into an insurrection. It's plenty of what happened. Now, if only 20 people went in, would I consider it an insurrection? I don't know. Maybe, maybe not. If only, 100 people went in, maybe. Maybe if 200 people went in and they got further, maybe. I'm not sure where exactly I would, slice the pie to call it, whatever we call it. But wherever we're at, we're way, 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 way over that. And I just don't think the comparisons to other more extreme coups or more extreme rebellions or anything in Russia, it just doesn't make any sense. It's only done to equivocate on what's actually happened or to do a whataboutism to something that I would probably plainly agree with. Like, wouldn't you agree this is a more serious coup or more serious insurrection? Yeah, sure. There can be more serious coups and more serious insurrections. Much the same, there could be more brutal murders of one person and another. It doesn't make one murder not a murder just because you did it easier or did it cleaner.
Okay, so first of all, the reason, as I said at the start, why historical comparisons or historic comparisons to other incidents are so important is because there's a gigantic ideological and partisan motive here in exaggerating the extent to which what happened on January 6th was a serious threat. And especially when somebody is a Democratic Party partisan who goes around saying the Democratic Party is better, we want people to go and vote for Democrats, we want to make sure Donald Trump doesn't return to power. And at the same time, the narrative they're pushing coincidentally aligns perfectly with their partisan agenda, then I think it's important to start questioning whether or not there's any authenticity to the beliefs based on how other situations have previously been treated. So let me just make 2 points here about what Donald Trump did. You're actually allowed to summon people to Washington to protest. It's one of the most important rights that the Constitution guarantees. The president is completely free to call his supporters to Washington and to tell them and argue for them that some injustice has been committed and that they ought to protest in response to it. There was one time and only one time when Donald Trump addressed the question of whether or not violence should be used when those people went to the Capitol. And what he said was this, quote, "I know that everybody here will soon be marching over to the Capitol building to peacefully and patriotically make your voices heard." And the fact that people, because he said peacefully, then have to resort to things like, oh, well, he invoked political cliches like fight like hell. Politicians use fight like hell in almost every speech. Joe Biden, you can read this in the New York Times on December 2nd, said, quote, "I want to make sure we're going to be fighting like hell." You can find pretty much every politician saying that. So that's one thing, is that to the extent you want to say that Donald Trump was somehow involved in this quote-unquote insurrection. The only thing he did was give a constitutionally protected speech, and that is the reason why Jack Smith has not charged him with inciting or participating in an insurrection. It's not my opinion. Obviously, Jack Smith shares the opinion that he could never obtain a conviction. The second thing is, on the numbers, 2,000 people, let's use the maximum number, went into the Capitol. A small percentage, a tiny percentage of people who went into the Capitol actually used violence. So most of those people, the vast majority, according to the US government themselves, were doing nothing other than peacefully protesting. Again, protesters entering the Capitol without authorization, occupying offices of members of Congress in order to pressure them to take some step or not take some step is something that happens all the time. We've seen many more than 2,000 protesters. So don't try and imply that on January 6th, 2,000 armed people or well-trained people intending to commit violence went into the Capitol. The most of that number that you could possibly squeeze out of it is something like 100 or 150, and now we're back way closer to the most ridiculous example that I began by asking you about, where even you said, oh, that probably shouldn't be called an insurrection, than we are to an actual threat to American power or to our system of government, which is necessary to claim in order to turn this into what you want to turn it into.
Okay, just
Seriously, anytime you go to a baseball game or a large parade or anything like that, what happens to cell phone service? It is very sketchy if you have a signal at all, right? So consider that there was 1 million people there in DC that day, and they were all listening to Donald Trump speak at the Ellipse, which is about a half-hour walk from the Capitol building, okay? And so Donald Trump spoke until roughly 1 o'clock, 1:15 that day, and the attack on the Capitol building started before Donald Trump was done speaking, and while all the real true Trump supporters were at the Ellipse, okay? So waiting for Donald Trump to finish speaking, and then 1 million people funneled down 2 streets. So they don't just instantly hit the road and start walking. It's probably 15, 20 minutes, especially for the people in the back, even longer, before they can even get to the road where it's a 30-minute walk to get to the Capitol, right? Okay, so while all that's going on, the worst parts of what went on at the Capitol were already going on. So that leads me to question, were the people at the Capitol at that time truly there to see Trump? I would guess no. I'm not going to say that every single one wasn't. Maybe they had seen Trump before and they bypassed on seeing Trump speak. I don't know why you would go to D.C. that day and bypass on that part of it just to stand there and wait at the Capitol building. Which you got to understand that the main doors were locked with a magnetic lock that people can't open from the outside no matter how big their hammer is, right? So Capitol Police opened those doors and started letting people in. And then they escorted folks around. And by the time the big Trump crowd got there, all the barricades were broken down. There was no indicator that you couldn't go past a certain spot or anything like that. So they filed as close to the Capitol building as possible, right? And you also have to understand that the side of the Capitol building that people were approaching from is not the side that was broken into. People broke into the far side of the Capitol. So you would have had to gone there, go all the way around the building to be on the side that was actually, violent. And remember, nobody had cell phone service. And I'm willing to bet that a lot of people's batteries on their cell phone was dead at that point from filming Donald Trump and everything else that was going on before that. But the main point that I need to make is that it was not an insurrection. All 1 million of those people left their weapons at home. And none of them believed that if they took over the Capitol building, that somehow they were going to take over the government. And like Glenn Greenwald said, no charges of insurrection have been filed simply because the district attorney knows that none of those charges would come to fruition in court. But these woke individuals like Destiny and Sink Uger and David Pacman and all these other people, these woke voices from the left, have it stuck in their head that it was an actual insurrection, an attack on government's democracy, and they're never going to back down from that position. They've maintained it for 4 years now, and if they ever back down, they're going to lose so much credibility, so much more than they've already lost. But watch Donald Trump win this election, and it's still yet to be seen how the Democrats, the left, is going to handle this peaceful transfer of power. And so with that, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Share this video and leave me a comment. Let me know what you think. And I'll see you guys in the next one.